So, welcome all you people on Twitch and YouTube. My name's Lee Brandt. I'm a developer advocate at Okta. I'm here with Aaron Parecki, who's also a developer advocate at Okta and also a member of the OAuth working group. Today I'm going to be interviewing Aaron about OAuth, and David Neal's also joined us, and he's going to take sketch notes so you can see how sketch notes are taken. So, Aaron, welcome.
Thanks.
So
Should be
today
fun.
we're going to talk, let's start with PKCE and auth code, because I know I've been using implicit flow in my spas for a while now, but the guidance from the OAuth working group is to drop implicit and use auth code with PKCE. So what is that?
Sure thing. So the implicit flow was a previously suggested technique that essentially allows, it was created for browsers to get access tokens back directly without an extra step of that authorization code exchange. So the implicit grant was a sort of shortcut, and it was necessary because browsers didn't have support for things like cross-origin resource sharing or really any crypto libraries in them at all. So it was a convenient shortcut, and it turns out that browsers have gotten a lot better over the last several years, right? And there's a lot of new APIs in browsers, and CORS is very common, used all over the place now. And what that means is that this sort of shortcut is no longer needed, this workaround. So in the meantime, Pixie had been developed for mobile apps. And the reason that mobile apps were the first ones to adopt it was because there was no cross-origin resource sharing restriction in mobile to begin with, because they're not browsers. And it was very clear that the risk of using the implicit flow in mobile was even higher, even greater, because there's less security around things like there's no DNS for redirect URLs in mobile. There's no registry of that. It was all based on custom URL schemes.
But you didn't want to put your secret in your mobile app, right? Like a
Right.
client
So
secret.
that's, I guess, yeah, that's the other part here. So with a mobile app as well as a single page app, there's no way to deploy a client secret there, which, although as we'll discuss later, Pixie is useful even if you do have a client secret, which is an interesting development.
Hmm.
But the sort of the origins of this was um, with the with mobile starting to use Pixie, then it was very widespread there, and then all of a sudden, once browsers got the APIs to be able to do it as well, why not have browsers also use Pixie? Because there was no longer a need for the sort of workaround shortcut of the implicit flow once browsers supported the proper APIs.
So what is a Pixie? I mean, we
What
know
is
it
a
stands
Pixie?
for proof key for code exchange, but what does that actually mean, and where does it come from?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So this is an extension to the authorization code flow. So in OAuth, we're not going to go over the whole OAuth from scratch here. We have plenty of other videos talking about how OAuth works. But the authorization code flow is the sort of core OAuth flow, and it works by the application redirecting the user's browser to the OAuth server, and then eventually they get redirected back to the application with an authorization code. So instead of the access token coming back in the redirect, which is what the implicit flow is, instead it's this temporary authorization code. It's one-time use, short-lived, and all it can do is go get an access token. It can be used to go get an access token. So that's the authorization code flow. And the problem is, just like with the implicit flow, that redirect step, there's ways that can fail and ways that can be intercepted and be stolen or hacked. So with the implicit, the risk is if that redirect step is intercepted, it's game over, right? The access token is stolen.
Yeah.
That's the end. The attacker wins. So at least with the authorization code flow, if the authorization code is stolen, then the attacker may be able to use it to get an access token at the token endpoint. So we need to protect that, right? One way to protect that is to use a client secret. So if you have a client secret, and if the app can keep that secret, which mobile apps can't, but that's a different story. If it's a web server app, then if the attacker steals the authorization code, no big deal, because they can't do anything with it, because they would also need the secret, and they can't have stolen the secret because it's like part of the source code of the app, right?
On the server, yeah.
On the server, yeah. Never accessible to anything where the attacker has access. So, okay, that's great. We've solved authorization code, stealing authorization codes for if you have a client secret. If you don't have a client secret, what happens? Well, if there's no client secret and someone steals the authorization code, then they could just use the authorization code to go get an access token. And that's now not great, right? We don't want to be in that situation again, because that's only now a little bit better than returning the access token directly.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, how can we fix this? Well, this is what PKCE solves. So PKCE solves this problem where if the authorization code is stolen, we're going to make it so that it's not usable. So let's talk about how this actually works then. If the first step of PKCE is the application makes up a random number, a random string. So step one is create a new secret. If you can't get one deployed to you, then you're just going to make one up for this flow. And it's unique for every time this app does a flow. It's going to be different every time. So step one, generate a random string. Step two is calculate a hash of that string. And this step is important because we're about to go and send something out into the world. And the idea with a hash is that it's a one-way operation. So you can think of a hashing algorithm that, don't use this in production, please, but the function may be called sum. So if I asked you, think of 10 random numbers and then add them together and then tell me the sum. If you tell me the sum of all the 10 numbers, I won't be able to tell you which 10 numbers you chose, right? Because it's like a one-way thing. You can't undo it.
Yeah.
That's not a very good algorithm. Don't use that in production, but it is a demonstration of a hashing algorithm. And so in practice, we actually use SHA-256 right now because that's plenty complex enough for current standards. And you might also be wondering why don't we use a better hash? Because we would never hash passwords with SHA-256, for example, because it's not actually secure enough to protect against, like, if a database of hashed passwords is stolen. But the reason that it's fine for this use is because we're not trying to protect data being stored, in a storage. We're trying to protect the authorization code for the lifetime of the authorization code.
It doesn't live forever. It only needs a short amount of time protection. Okay.
Exactly. And these typically last 60 seconds tops. So we really only need a hash function that can't be broken in 60 seconds. Right.
Okay.
So SHA-256 on a sufficiently long random string is good enough for now. Eventually we'll have to upgrade this to 512 or some other hash, but we'll do that when we need to. So great. Generate a hash. Now, when the application starts the OAuth flow, it's going to build up its URL with the normal parameters like its client ID, its redirect URL, and all that stuff. It's going to also then include the hashed value, the hashed secret. So this is the step where it's kind of like throwing this out into the world, right? Like anybody, an attacker is assumed that they may be able to actually see this request at this point. It's opening up in a browser, it's getting sent over the network. So at that point, the authorization server does the normal thing of like ask the user to log in, ask for permission, like do you allow this application to do this thing? And if the user clicks yes, then just like normal in the auth code flow, the authorization server returns back the authorization code. And there's no difference here in PKCE. This is the same as the auth code flow. So that redirect still only has the authorization code. So now this is the step that we're trying to protect, right? That authorization server returns that code in the redirect, which might get stolen somehow. So, but this time, if the attacker does steal the authorization code, we need to make sure that they can't do anything with it. And because the application first sent that hash earlier, when they go to use the authorization code, they have to prove that they control that hash, proving it by sending the original random secret they generated at the beginning. And because we've used a hashing algorithm that both the client and the server know, the server can calculate the hash itself and compare the two hashes then. And if they match, then the authorization server knows that the thing making the request with the authorization code is the same thing that started the flow at the beginning.
Okay, so who's generating the PKCE? Am I doing that before I make the initial call to get the auth code, or is the authorization server doing that?
Yeah, the PKCE secret, it's actually called the code verifier, which I don't think that actually helps. The name is not great. But the PKCE secret that's generated is generated by the application. So it's part of it's before the app does anything else to start the flow.
Okay. Okay, so I send the PKCE code to the server when I go to authenticate, and
You send the hash.
yeah, the hashed PKCE, and the authorization server sends me back the consent form of the authorization, whatever it is, username, password stuff, and then when it sends me back the authorization code, in order to get an access token, I take that hashed value or do I take the original value before it's been hashed that generated that random string and the authorization code to get an access token?
Yeah, so think about it this way. So we've got this, let's back up a second and talk about the two different ways data is moving around in the system. And that's front channel versus back channel. And hopefully that'll help understand help us figure out where we need to be sending which part. So the back channel is the sort of like normal method that two things talk to each other, like on the internet, right? It's a client to server HTTPS connection. And there's a bunch of properties of a back channel connection that are very useful that we often take for granted. And that is things like, like it's over HTTPS, which means that connection we know which server we're talking to because we can validate the certificate. Once the connection is established, that connection is encrypted. So nothing can jump in and steal the data or mess with the data in transit. And that also means that as a consequence of that, whatever data you get back in the response to an HTTPS request, you can believe is legitimate because you know where it came from and you know it can't be tampered with. So I like to think of this as hand delivering a message where you can actually, walk up to somebody, you can hand them a package, and you can see that they took it, and they can see who you are, and you can see that nobody came in and stole it. So, hand delivering a note. And that is a very useful delivery mechanism, and we should use it whenever we can, right? The other way the data moves around in OAuth is in the front channel. And the front channel is the idea of actually using the user's browser to move data between two computers, two different systems. So the request here is actually between the application and the OAuth server, right? Those are the two parties here. What's trying to happen in an OAuth flow is the application is trying to request some data, and then in order to access that data, it's going to need an access token. So really what the app is trying to do is get an access token from the OAuth server. Now, it can't just go and ask the OAuth server for an access token for some user because we need to make sure the user is there and agrees to this. So we need to get the user involved, which is why we use the browser. So what that actually means, though, is that we end up with the browser being the one that moves data between these two different parties, the application and the OAuth server. And the first thing it's moving is the request the app makes. So the app makes a request and says, I'm trying to get a user to log in. And that request will include client ID, redirect URL, scope, and all that stuff, right? And then the second thing that's moving is the access token. And we need to get the access token from the OAuth server to the application. Now, this is the key. That access token is the sort of like crown jewels, right? That's the, if that's stolen, it's game over. So we only ever want to deliver the access token in the back channel, right? So we're going to make sure we only deliver the access token in the back channel, which means we need now to be able to still use the front channel to negotiate this exchange. So think of the front channel as a delivery service. So the back channel, you go hand deliver your message. That's obviously not very convenient. The front channel is like using a courier service where you're actually putting something in the mail, packaging it up, and then handing it off to a delivery service where they then go deliver it to the recipient. And the reason this is a useful analogy is because as soon as you hand that package off to the delivery service, it's out of your control and you never actually know if it made it. And you don't know if it's been intercepted or copied or whatever, right? There's a lot of different ways that a package could fail to be delivered. And you may trust the courier because you're paying them and maybe you have insurance on the package, whatever, that's all fine. But you still don't ever actually know if it's there. Even with tracking info, you never actually know. All that the tracking info shows you is that the courier service claims it's been delivered, right? So if you're sending data in the front channel, you can't ever be sure if it made it there. And there's a problem on the receiving end as well, which is that if you get a package in the mail, you don't ever actually know who it's from. It might have a return address on it, but that can be faked, right? I can put anybody's return address on a package and mail it. It's not legal, but you can do it. So you, as the receiver, you never actually really know who sent the package. So this is sort of the problem with using the front channel. So we have to treat it as the sort of not super reliable, untrusted channel, even if we believe that it'll work most of the time. So taking this back into the OAuth world, we know we want to deliver the access token via the back channel. We're never going to put an access token in the mail and ship it. We want to hand deliver that message. So we want the application to go directly to the OAuth server to get the access token. But the application, we already said, the application can't just go and approach the OAuth server and say, hey, this dude says it's okay if I access his data, right? We want to make sure that user actually agreed to this. And that's where we're going to get the front channel involved. So in the PKCE flow, the front channel, the first step in the front channel is the app makes a request to the OAuth server, but it doesn't talk to the OAuth server directly. It ships a package through the user's browser. And it says, I'm trying to access data. And that means, because it's a front channel request, we're not going to send anything that we don't expect to be intercepted. So in that case, we're only ever going to send the hashed value, because the hashed value doesn't matter if it's intercepted. Because if it's intercepted, they can't figure out what the original secret was. So we send the hash value in the front channel. The OAuth server gets this package in the mail, and it's a request from the app. And the OAuth server isn't actually super confident the app made the request. It could have been a faked package. But then the OAuth server negotiates with the user and says, hey, did you actually agree? Did you actually want to do this? If so, that's cool. And then if the user says yes, the OAuth server generates this authorization code, which is, again, short-lived, one-time use, puts it back in the mail, ships it back to the application in the front channel. And again, because this is the front channel, we have to assume that somebody might be snooping on the mail and can see the authorization code. But notice what's happened here. What have we put in the mail? The only things that have gone in the mail are the hash and the authorization code. That original secret hasn't actually been sent anywhere yet. So the original secret the app made up hasn't left the device. So the package from the OAuth server arrives back at the application with the authorization code in it. The application says, this is an authorization code. It probably is from the OAuth server, but are we really sure? I don't know. Let's go find out. And then what it does is it takes that and then makes a back channel request and talks to the OAuth server directly and says, hey, I got this authorization code and here's the secret I used to request it. And because it's doing that over the back channel, that can't be intercepted. And the OAuth server says, okay, well, let me double check, compares the secret, calculates the hash of it, compares it to the hash it got in the mail. And if it matches, then it knows that the package it sent actually did make it back to the intended recipient.
Okay.
Does that kind of make more sense? So if you think about the front channel, back channel methods, that can help you answer the questions of which piece gets sent in which step.
Yeah, and I guess, so where's this back channel coming from if it's a spa app? Do I have to have a back end in order to do anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the back channel does not mean it is a server. It does not mean server side. It means HTTPS connection. So a browser can make a back channel request. And what that looks like is we used to call it AJAX, right? AJAX request. It's just a HTTP connection.
Request, right?
It needs to be a post request. Otherwise, it's written on the top of the envelope, right? So it needs to be a post request. But if the browser makes a request from JavaScript, cross origin or whatever, from within the JavaScript runtime, that is a back channel request. It's only a front channel request if it leaves the DOM and goes through the address bar.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the reason that the authorization code can go through the address bar, because we don't care if it's stolen as long as we've got a PKCE or a client secret to be able to verify that it's now us using that authorization code to exchange for an access token. Correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So is there any way for people to, I'm assuming that this is not completely secure, right? Nothing's completely secure.
Nothing is completely secure.
But how close is this getting to like auth code and client secret security level versus auth code and PKCE? Did that get us a lot closer, or is it still pretty shaky doing that stuff through the browser, and I should probably stick to server side stuff?
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. So yes, nothing is perfectly secure. However, that's not actually a very useful way of thinking about it. Instead, the way to think about it is, what threats are you worried about, and have you solved those threats? So there's actually been a ongoing discussion in the OAuth mailing list for a while now about what to include in the security BCP, because this is a new document that is describing the most secure way, like the best current practice for OAuth security, right? Like, how can we best do OAuth now? And that's a big question. There's a lot of different kinds of attacks that can happen, and what are the ones that are worth mentioning, and what is sort of in scope of OAuth. And you can imagine that there's a huge range of kinds of attacks, everything from, it's not just that we're worried about somebody intercepting HTTP requests. In some cases, you're worried about authorization servers intentionally misbehaving to steal data that they shouldn't be able to access. Where, like, normally we think of the authorization server as the one, guarding data, but in some environments, when there's multiple authorization servers involved, maybe belonging to different organizations, being used across different apps belonging to different organizations, you have to be concerned about an authorization server misbehaving. And There's also the case of users intentionally misbehaving. Like, there's always I think a classic example of this is a website that is going to let you, you're only gonna be able to order liquor online if you're over 21. So the website needs to know if you're 21. And how are you going to stop someone from just using somebody else's login, right? Like, users can cooperate to bend, break the system. So there is no perfect security, right? There's nothing you can do to make it 100% secure. What you can do is protect against certain kinds of attacks and make sure that you are safe against those specific attacks. So if you, so one of the most common vulnerabilities in web apps is cross-site scripting, cross-site vulnerability, right? XSS or whatever you want to call it. And the reason it's so prevalent is because it's so easy for people to even intentionally use third-party hosted JavaScript in their application. It's not just that you have your build time environment packaging everything up into one JS file and that's the only JavaScript there. You're also going to have things like your ad networks or your analytics tools that are probably on different domains. And as soon as you start bringing things in from different domains or not being entirely sure of your build pipeline and what libraries you actually are using, the possibility for cross-site scripting attacks is just pretty high. It's there, and you have to be worried about it. So we generally consider cross-site scripting vulnerabilities a more likely attack than, for example, breaking an HTTPS connection. HTTPS might be intercepted as well, right? Like, there's actually a lot of corporate networks that intentionally intercept, terminate an HTTPS connection from machines on their own network and then reestablish a connection out to a server. Technically, that's breaking HTTPS because HTTPS is supposed to be completely silent from, completely connected and private from client to server, but you can kind of like fake it by breaking it in the middle as long as you've intentionally, installed root certificates on your machines and all that. So that kind of attack isn't something that is very practical for a random person to attack a random victim, right? Whereas cross-site scripting is. So we consider those in different categories of attacks. Okay. So to get back to your original question of what was your question?
I guess basically I'm thinking of it like it's not nothing is completely secure, but every once in a while you have to walk out to your car in the parking lot in the dark. And so the best thing you can do is, keep your keys in your hand and keep a flashlight handy and maybe keep your cell phone handy to keep yourself as safe as you can be, but you still have to walk across the parking lot.
Yeah, so with PKCE, PKCE does not attempt to solve if your HTTPS was broken, PKCE is still broken, right? PKCE doesn't try to solve that. What PKCE is solving is the more common problem of a front channel request being intercepted and those sort of, that class of attacks. So even though it's not going to solve everything, you are still better off doing it because the alternatives are worse. So the alternatives being the implicit flow or not using a client secret and just doing an authorization code exchange anyway, those are way worse than PKCE in the same categories. So PKCE is solving problems that exist with those other methods. And even though it doesn't go so far to solve everything, it's still a good idea.
Yeah.
So then I guess taking this back to the JavaScript app example, you had asked about should you get everything out of JavaScript and do it all server-side?
Yeah.
Right. And that is certainly an option as well. So if you are doing an OAuth exchange in a browser, then you do always have to be worried about cross-site scripting. And anytime you're building a JavaScript app, you have to be worried about cross-site scripting. If you are doing the OAuth exchange in the browser, then if you have a cross-site scripting vulnerability, the risk is that the attacker may actually get an access token. And if the attacker gets an access token and they have cross-site scripting capabilities, they can send the access token out somewhere and start using it outside of the browser. So that's clearly bad. If you are more worried about that scenario, then it turns out the options are actually very limited. So and it's because just the browser is kind of a wild west environment of like, there's just so much stuff going on there and so many things can go wrong. There isn't a secure storage API in browsers, for example, right? I hope someday we get one, but like mobile apps have a place where mobile apps can store data securely that other apps can't get to and the rest of the device can't get to. But in browsers, that's not the case, at least yet. And what that means is that just always will be a problem. So if you are concerned about that and don't trust your environment enough to be confident that you don't have any cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, then the only option left is to get OAuth out of the browser. And if you do that, you actually get a lot of really cool security properties that are really beneficial. So the pattern there is to set up a backend for your single page app, and the backend is the one responsible for doing the OAuth exchange. And the only thing it will ever send back to the browser is a session cookie. And the reason that this is useful is because if your single page app is only ever talking to this backend and you use a session cookie, you can make it HTTP only. You can make it secure, HTTPS only. You can, which basically means that the JavaScript itself can't even see that cookie value. It has no way to access it. And if the JavaScript can't access the data, then JavaScript can't steal the data. Yeah. So if you then have a cross-site scripting vulnerability, it can't get access to the session cookie, much less the access token, because the access token isn't even in the browser in the first place.
Okay.
The downside.
So
no, go ahead.
If your security needs to be really high, then do not do the OAuth flows in the browser. Do them on a server somewhere.
Yeah, and if you do them on a server, it means that the access tokens never exist in the browser environment. And the only thing that can ever use the access tokens is your server-side environment. And that limits your cross-site scripting vulnerabilities to the attacker being able to make a request from the JavaScript to its backend to make the backend make requests. Yeah. And that's very, very different than using access tokens arbitrarily.
Okay, so it's really just about, I don't know what the word is, making smaller your attack surface.
Yep, exactly.
Making your attack surface. Okay.
Yeah, like we're not claiming that we can solve cross-site scripting attacks, right? Yeah. That's not what we're doing by moving OAuth to the server. But what we are doing is making the ramifications of a attack being pulled off not matter as much, because what they can do is a lot smaller.
Yeah, and I think that's a common misconception with especially people who might go out and read the OAuth working group notes or the spec for OAuth, is they think that if I follow this, I'll be completely 100% secure. And that's not actually the case. Nothing is completely secure. All we're doing is, all the OAuth group is trying to do is minimize the attack surface, the amount of angles that an attacker can come at you and try and get an access token, because that's really what they want, right? So if we make it harder for them to get an access token, then hopefully they'll just give up and leave before they break into your car, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about embedded and hosted logins, because this is not meant to be an Okta commercial by any means. I mean, we're all Okta employees here, but everyone who does OAuth as a service most of them have an option for embedding a login screen or redirecting to a hosted login screen. And we were having a conversation not too long ago about why one is better than the other. So can you explain to me why one would be better than the other, or more secure, I suppose?
Yeah. So this again gets back to this idea that nothing is perfect, right? And we are always trading things off. So The idea of a hosted login page is that the login page is embedded within the application that's doing the login. And the main reason that people want to do that at all is for the user experience benefits of it, not because it's more secure at all. The reason people want to do it is for the user experience of the user never leaving the application and being able to log in to the application. And that's, a benefit. That is a benefit. But
Yeah, I mean, especially today with as many scams that are going on out there, it's easy for you to feel like you're being phished if you click on login and you're taken to a completely different URL, right?
yeah, it's an interesting point too. But here's some of the reasons why a hosted login page isn't as good. And there's it is always going to be this trade-off. It's always going to be different factors here. But with a hosted login page, it's putting the login form within the application, which means so like if you only have one application and one OAuth server, this is probably fine. As soon as you get multiple applications, this starts to actually become a liability
Okay, now when
because
you say hosted login, are you talking about JavaScript that's embedded in your app, or are you talking about the hosted login redirect?
oh, I'm talking about JavaScript within an app. Is that not the
Okay.
right name?
Well, I guess when I say that, I'm saying the embedded login, and then there's
Okay,
hosted login where it's hosted somewhere else on an
got
authorization
it.
server in an IDP, whatever.
Let me try to make sure I use the right words. So embedded login, embedded within the app, that's the one I'm talking about that has the usually
Okay.
better experience
Better
for
user
users
experience, but
because
it has some disadvantages. Okay, that's
has
where you were.
security disadvantages.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where I was at. So with the embedded login within an application, if you only have one application, it's probably fine because the story is very straightforward of this is what the login page looks like and this is how you know you're at the right one. If you're embedding that into multiple different applications, that's where it starts to get dangerous. And the reason is because you're going to have a mobile app, you're going to have a web server based app, you're going to have maybe an app with a different branding in it or on a different domain. And if all of those start to embed the same login form and that login form is asking you for credentials for some, shared account across all of them, that starts to look like phishing. And then if an attacker does throw up a login form that looks very similar, that asks for your Google password or whatever it was, right? And it is a phishing attack, you're not going to be able to tell the difference anymore because now there's too many different places that you're asked to put in your password. I think a really good example of this, not in the web world, is in desktop computers, where you might see like the Apple sign with your Apple account pop up on your computer, where it's like iTunes does it, but then also the App Store does it, and then also the browser when you're on iCloud.com asks you for your Apple
Yeah, I've
login.
had that a couple of times, and every time it comes up, I'm thinking, I don't know if
Yeah, like
Apple
how do
would
you
actually pop
know
up.
what you're
Yeah,
typing your password into, right?
yeah,
That's the problem, is that once you start getting all these password dialogues that look different, that are asking you for the same login, that is what a phishing attack is. And you can never really be sure that you're typing your password into the right thing.
yeah.
So that's why the embedded login starts to be dangerous once you start using it in more than one place. And then so the alternative there is to switch to the redirect based one, or I guess the hosted, where it's if you switch to a proper OAuth flow where you actually are redirecting the user out to the OAuth server, now the story becomes a lot better because you can tell users this is what a login page looks like. You should only ever see this on this one domain. It should only ever be on okta.okta.com. Like we know, that's what we know when we are using our Okta logins for
Yeah,
employee stuff. I'm never going to enter my Okta password into anything other than okta.okta.com, right?
yeah,
And that is much easier to educate people on.
yeah,
Like if Apple were to do this, they would say only ever enter your Apple ID on iCloud.com, right?
yeah. Well, and
And that would be
plus,
a lot.
if I embed this in my page, I'm still responsible for taking that username and password that the user types in into my user interface and sending it, right?
Yep.
Whether it's being, whether it's a package that I downloaded from Okta or whoever to send that, but I'm still having to send that from my JavaScript to an authorization server. Whereas if I go with like a hosted login, I'm redirecting to their servers, and this is all server to server communication amongst themselves back there, where the username and password never even hit my site, right? So they never
Yep.
even land, and I never have to worry about the security of a username and password in transit.
So yeah, you brought up an excellent point. If you do have an embedded login form, even if it's not necessarily code that you wrote to do that, if you've embedded the JavaScript for that into your application, it is responsible for password security then, because any cross-site scripting attack then is going to be able to extract the password potentially,
Yeah.
because the password does exist within your application, at least at least temporarily. And there's another point here, which is not always relevant for our customers or people building their own applications, but that is around the idea of user consent. So in a third-party situation, we know now that you would never type your Google password into anything other than Google. That used to not be the case. You used to see things like asking for your Google password that weren't Google, and they would go and then log into your Google account to get data. And even if you agreed to do that, this is a problem because Google can never actually be sure that you agreed to it. All they see is someone using the password. And it's very easy for an application to abuse that. So any form of the application collecting the user's password has that problem where the authorization server doesn't really get any guarantees that the user did actually agree to this data being sent. So that's again where the redirect method has a benefit, because the redirect method means that the user is negotiating with the OAuth server directly and actually confirming this request there. And the OAuth server then gets to be sure that the user agreed to it because that's who was asked.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, at least for me, when I first got started with like diving into OAuth, one of the things that, because as developers, we think of the OAuth stuff, and when you say OAuth, automatically I start thinking about authentication and a login form, right? And OAuth has absolutely nothing to do with authentication, right? It's all about authorization, right? And I think that once developers get past that, that OAuth is not about your login form. It's about giving you consent to access something that I own.
Yeah.
Then
This
it
is
becomes clearer.
I don't really like the discussion of authentication versus authorization because the words are very similar and they sound the same to non-native speakers, and that it's just confusing. It's too confusing. So I like to think of it instead as, like you said, OAuth is about accessing data. OAuth is always about an application being able to access data somewhere. What that data is completely depends on what the system is. And in some cases, that data might be the user's identity, right? And this is why you can build a login page with OAuth. So OAuth is about accessing data. That data can be something like their photos or their medical records or their identity. If you use it to access their identity, you've just built a login system. And that is what OpenID Connect is. So OpenID Connect is OAuth in its foundation, and then it adds in the idea that the data being accessed is the user's identity.
Okay.
So the user's identity gets returned back at the end of that flow, as well as an access token.
So that's why if you were to put OpenID as a scope, you generally get back the email of the person or their username and their user ID or whatever from the. But you generally, when you see an OpenID Connect call being made, the two scopes you're asking for is OpenID and profile, right? So that you can get their name and some of their preferences and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it uses the scope value, because scope is describing what data the application is trying to access. And OpenID Connect defines a few scopes talking about what kinds of a user's profile data. So email, profile, there's also like phone and address and all that stuff in there as well.
But once you start getting to, like, for instance, if I log in with Facebook onto something, they could ask for the what would you call it? The posting scope, whatever that scope is,
Hmm.
that says I want to be able to post on your timeline on your behalf.
Hmm.
Those sorts of things will show up in the scopes on the consent screen that says, here's the thing that this app wants access to. Um, but that scope is not, it's not defined in OAuth or OpenID Connect, right? That's a custom scope. So how do we create those, and what do we do with them?
Yeah, it turns out that it's entirely up to your API to deal with it. So, and this is because, again, OAuth is a framework. It's meant to be a framework for negotiating this access. And then sort of what happens after that is up to your API to
Kind of
deal with.
generic, right?
Yeah. And it's because there isn't really a standard data format for anything, right? Like there's no standard structure of data across all APIs ever. If
Yeah.
there was, we might be able to standardize some more scopes. But that's why OpenID Connect can standardize profile scopes, because we generally agree that someone's name is a useful piece of information about them, and that's generally consistent across all online systems. That there's a name field, and then there's also email. Some servers may not store the user's address, in which case the address scope doesn't do anything, but that's in the spec as well. But as far as like everything else, it's sort of up for grabs.
Yeah, I
So
mean, those
if your
scopes could be
API,
anything, right? Could
yeah, it
be,
can be whatever you want.
yeah.
So if your API has the ability to make a post on someone's wall, or upload a photo, or read their medical records, or move money from one account to another, all these things are very different from each other, and you want to make sure that you are properly communicating that action to the user when the user is granting this privilege to an application. So that's what scope is for. It's for segmenting up access so that applications don't have to just get access to everything. And it also means that it's up to you to define your scopes and to enforce them.
Yeah.
Because all the OAuth server is really doing is sort of mediating the initial exchange.
Yeah, so once I create my medical record scope or whatever, if I'm creating a medical app, then it's up to me to check that they asked for the medical scope, and that they use to kind of get what the user's response was, and say, okay, they said you can or they said you can't, and act accordingly in my own app. So once we get outside of the small number of basic scopes like OpenID and profile and things like that that are part of the spec, once I get outside of that, it's up to me to enforce that, right?
Yeah, the OAuth server, all the OAuth server is going to do is help in the negotiation between the app and make sure the user agrees to it. So if you have a scope defined that says, access to medical records, then the app can request that. The user should see that prompt, and then the OAuth server will be like, cool, I'm going to make sure that I store that consent somewhere. And the way it does that is going to depend on the OAuth server. In Okta, what it does is it puts that scope into the access token, which is a JSON web token. But that can be different depending on different OAuth servers. So Okta will take the scope value, put it into the JSON web token, and then when your app makes a request to an API, the API can say, let's double check first that the access token is valid. Second, let's double check who the user is and see if they have any data here. And then, okay, I see that this API request is trying to access this user's medical records. Let's double check that the access token contains the right scope. But it's the API's job to actually enforce that, because all that the OAuth server has done there is dealt with the sort of asking the user and then sticking that scope value into the token.
Yeah, so if the user says, yes, you can see my email, you can see my profile, but you can't post on my behalf, then that scope wouldn't come back in the access token, or however that authorization server delivers that scope, right? And
Yep.
it's the API's job to say, okay, before I let them post on their behalf, I got to check to make sure that scope has been listed in the access token or wherever.
Yep.
Okay, and this is from Micah, who's also a coworker and nice internet troll, asking a question. Love the idea that using authorization and authentication isn't great as the words are too close together, but I missed what a better alternative or terms might be. what would be a better way to talk about the differences between the two?
Yeah. So OAuth I think of as accessing data. It's always about getting data. And then authentication would be who is the user, getting their identity, learning who they are, and being able to confirm that. So accessing data versus identifying the user. And then those two things don't sound anything alike, and it's a lot clearer.
Nice. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about here is passwordless, because this is one of the things that's kind of been confusing even me as we talk about it in Okta and as this feature gets added to other IDPs around the world. What is passwordless login?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple different ways to think about it. So it turns out that passwordless login actually meshes very well with OAuth, especially if you're doing a redirect-based flow. And that's, again, one of the reasons to do a redirect flow instead of trying to embed stuff in an application. So the whole idea with passwordless is to not have passwords, right? That's what it means. Let's try to be able to log in without passwords. There's many different ways you can do that. And there's actually a very common one that exists in many websites today, which is magic link through email. Right?
Oh, like Slack.
There's plenty of, like what?
Like Slack.
Oh, Slack. Yeah, right. So you can just type in your email address into a form, click go, you get a link in your email, you click it, and now you're logged in. There was no password there. That's super cool. And a lot of websites will do this.
Sorry, it's doing the verification by knowing that you own that email address? Is that?
All it's really verifying is that the person that typed in the email into the browser has access to that email.
Okay.
So just like, a password can be stolen. Someone can guess a password or steal a password from another password dump database and log into somebody else's account by using that password. So that is, passwords aren't perfect either. And a password doesn't really act as a confirmation of who the user is because it can be stolen.
Yeah.
So email just changes that to be, well, we're just trying to make sure that whoever was sitting in front of the computer when they typed in that email address does in fact have access to that email account. Okay. That's all it's telling you. It's not telling you that it's the real person or whatever, just like a password doesn't really tell you that it's the real person. And generally this is good enough, and we assume that if someone's email is hacked, they have bigger problems. So this works well, but the problem is that's like not a great flow for a lot of cases. It's often awkward on mobile to have to like swap back to your email app, and then you get distracted by answering emails and you forget what you were doing, trying to log in to whatever app it was. So, it's not the best option by any means, but it is a passwordless method that does exist in a lot of websites today, and it is useful. One of the passwordless methods that I'm most excited about is using WebAuthn, and that's a new browser API which can be used for a lot of things. You can use it for a second factor in addition to a password or something else, but you can also use it. You could use it as the only factor, and the reason this is super exciting to me is because it's actually been integrated into browsers at the browser level as well as the operating system level. So it's not just a browser API, it's actually got cooperation the whole way down the stack, including down to like the security chips on a device. So with WebAuthn, what you'll see, if you're on like Safari, for example, if a website does WebAuthn, it'll pop open like Face ID. It'll be like your Apple ID confirmation. And if you're on Windows, it'll do the Windows Hello thing. And if you're in Chrome, or if you're on Android, it'll do like the native Android login. Like it goes all the way down to the stack, through the stack into the OS. But then it's available in a browser. So you could use this for straight up passwordless because it's a way to prove it doesn't actually give you any identity information, but what it does do is the authentication part of it. So it proves that the same user is returning, which is what you want most of the time with authentication, right? If you're trying to learn about the user's identity, that's a different problem. That's an OAuth problem. That's accessing information about them. But if you're just trying to authenticate the user, you just want to make sure that the same user that came in today is the same one that's here tomorrow. And that's what WebAuthn gives you. So if you sign up to a website using WebAuthn, the website's not going to get any identifying information about you. But then when you come back tomorrow and do the WebAuthn thing again, it'll return the same identifier for that user, and the website can know it's the same person returning.
So this could be any factor. It doesn't have to just be magic link, but that's the one that anybody who uses Slack has seen those. But it could be like an RSA key, or it could be a YubiKey, or anything like that, as long as they can verify that you're the same person that accessed this information yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually, again, why WebAuthn is super cool, because it does integrate with a lot of those different actual hardware things. So like in Chrome, it'll pop open a little thing in the browser that says, choose how you want to authenticate here, whether it's fingerprint because you're on a Mac, or a YubiKey because it's plugged in over USB, or whatever actual authentication chip you want to use. And then it's exposed the same in the browser to the application.
It's interesting. I'm glad you said that about the fact that, I mean, because initially my first thought was, okay, the magic link doesn't really verify that it's me, but I'm glad you pointed out the fact that the password doesn't either, right?
Yeah.
People just automatically assume that since it's my email and my password, that they're verifying that it is indeed me, right? When really they're just verifying that you are the person with those credentials, which could be anybody in the world, right?
That kind of gets back to our original point of like, what attacks are you trying to protect against? Because like plenty of people share Netflix accounts, right? That's a thing that happens.
Yeah.
And that means that your Netflix password is by no means an identifier of you as a person, right? Because people are very willing to share their Netflix password. And again, the same thing is true even with like a YubiKey, because I could just give my YubiKey to somebody. So
yeah,
it's changing the way that would happen, but there isn't really a like, are you really this person at all? Because there's actually very little that can be done to even attempt to answer that question.
it's interesting because I remember telling somebody once upon a time, probably because somebody smarter than me told me that, oh God, I can't remember what it was. Nothing is completely secure, but what we're trying to do is strike that balance between usability and security, right? Because the only truly secure computer system is the one that's unplugged, right?
Yeah.
And so every step that you take to
And
make it
powered
more
off.
usable, yeah, everything you do to make it more usable makes it a little bit less secure. So you're trying to strike that balance between usability and security. And this is like when I first saw passwordless, I was like, who is asking for this? Why are we building this? Who was asking for it? But it makes total sense if I have something like, let's say my Apple TV is secured, right? And you need to log in to be able to watch any movies. Well, nobody wants to get out that little tiny remote and try and type in a secure password, but maybe putting a YubiKey in there, you protect its security by putting it inside your house and locking the door, right? Where just knowing that anybody in the house can now access the Apple TV because the YubiKey is completely plugged in all the time and it's just completely wide open. But you have to be inside the house in order to be able to use the thing. So then your security, I guess your threat monitoring has changed, right? So no, I'm glad you said that because I guess I always think of password as being the ultimately secure thing, but as everyone knows, it's easier. Anyone who's ever been hacked on Facebook or Twitter or whatever knows, or the gram, as the kids are saying today.
Yeah.
So if anybody else has we got a few more minutes here. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. And we're going to put this up live on YouTube, and it'll be obviously there on the Twitch stream. So if you watch it later, you can post your questions down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our Twitch channel, to our YouTube channel, wherever else you might be watching this. Oh, here's a question from Heather. What's next for OAuth to keep an eye on? What things are coming out that we need to keep an eye on?
Yeah, awesome question. So I am in the middle of working on OAuth 2.1, which is mostly just a consolidation of existing OAuth stuff, of a bunch of existing specs, trying to make the specs easier to read and so that there's less text to wade through. There are, however, a lot of new features in OAuth on the horizon coming from various use cases and in different groups. Too much to go into right now, but there's a lot of interesting features solving these different attacks from different angles. So, we've talked about how, Pixie is solving a front channel attack, but it doesn't solve users collaborating with each other, right? So, or authorization servers trying to do malicious things. So there's a bunch of different extensions happening to solve a lot of those other angles. And that's coming in the forms of usually OAuth extensions. And I have talked about a couple of those on some of the recent, in some recent conferences. So if you look on YouTube, and I think there's some on the Okta developer channel talking about that. I've described a couple of those extensions already. So super cool stuff going on there. And lots to keep an eye on. OAuth is by no means dying or dead or anything. It is very actively being worked on and extended to improve with a bunch of new use cases. So yeah, super exciting stuff.
Every time I listen to Aaron, he gives me a different way of thinking about things to make them more easily understood. Keep it up and thank you. So yeah, every time, boy, if it has to do with OAuth or cameras, I can usually go to Aaron in about 5-10 minutes. I'm understanding more than I've understood in the last several months.
Yeah,
so
awesome.
Speaking
Thanks.
of understanding, this sketch notes that we have here in the main window is outstanding. David, are there any tips and tricks for people to get started? I know one of the most asked questions is going to be, what's the app you're using?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I was still on mute or not. So let me turn me on. The app I'm using is called Procreate. It's one of the best apps available for iPad. Unfortunately, it is only for the iPad. There are some great apps out there for note taking and for sketchnoting. One's called Concepts, and it's available for iPad and Android and Windows. If you're using a Windows tablet,
Oh, nice.
And there's other ones too. Adobe makes some great apps, but this is my go-to drawing and sketching application.
Nice.
And I'll make this available after I do some more cleanup and so forth, that we can post it somewhere.
Okay. Well, that was a little over an hour. We did get a couple of questions, but I think we covered everything. Aaron, there's no other window other than this comments window, right?
Yep.
Where comments would be coming in. Okay. So thanks to Aaron for joining us today, and thanks for David for drawing this, because I'm going to be referring to these notes that David puts up and going, oh yeah, that was what we were talking about. So thanks to both of you guys for taking some time out of your day. I know it's busy. We're getting really close to Halloween, so I'm really disappointed that nobody dressed up in a costume, including myself. So yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. Make sure you hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Twitch channel, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.